done, maybe blowing off a little bit of steam. You see, she just got some really bad news.
The question didn't crash into the room. It floated, soft, almost tender, like something that belonged to a safer time, a simpler life. You're daddy's little girl. You were the youngest. What did you feel your parents expected you to become? She smiled when she answered. A small smile. Careful, polite, the kind of smile people give when they know they're being watched, even if the room feels quiet. Like all parents, they want their children to be happy. Then came the follow-up, gentle but sharper. Are you happy? The pause that followed said more than the words ever could. It wasn't hesitation, it was calculation.
To the House Oversight Chair, James Comer, saying initially they were just going to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights, but they say now that they are willing to cooperate if, and this is a huge if, some big demands are met.
I am happy in the sense that I have many things to be grateful for, she said slowly. But I have a wish for myself, just to be able to achieve something. At the time, almost no one noticed. It was just another interview, another clip buried under years of noise. But now those words land differently, heavier, because the story that unfolds from here is not warm or comforting or neat. It doesn't tie itself up with a bow. It drags, it leaks, it unsettles. For years, people believed the chapter was closed. The trial ended. The verdict was delivered. The headlines faded. Jeffrey Epstein was dead. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted. The world exhaled and moved on, assuming the door had finally slammed shut. But silence doesn't mean the truth disappeared. Sometimes it only means the truth is waiting for the moment when silence stops being useful.
Just amazing to me. And this is why this stuff has to be passed line by line by line. It is riven with clues about the Epstein case.
According to claims now circulating inside a narrative few expected to reopen, that moment may have arrived. From inside a prison cell where reputation no longer matters and leverage looks very different, Ghislaine Maxwell has reportedly begun speaking, not in dramatic confessions, not in public statements, but in fragments, in recollections, in names spoken without fear. When alliances collapse, memory becomes dangerous. And among the names quietly drifting back into whispered conversation is one many believed existed far outside that world. Meghan Markle. Not the Duchess, not the royal figure, not the carefully managed symbol, but a woman from an earlier chapter when anonymity was valuable and access mattered more than fame. This is not a story of accusation, it's a story of proximity. According to the narrative, photographs long believed lost have resurfaced. Images taken before global recognition, before palace gates, before the narrative was rewritten. They don't shock at first glance. No obvious scandal, no dramatic wrongdoing, just rooms, gatherings, yachts, smiles that feel ordinary until context enters the frame. And context changes everything.
This day, it is my biggest shame that I carry around that I will never get rid of. And I'm really, really sad that I brought other girls my age.
For years, these images were assumed gone, quietly scrubbed, locked behind restricted archives, detached from names and timelines. Their disappearance was subtle enough that most people never noticed. But records don't simply vanish on their own, not without intention, not without risk assessment. According to source claims, these images became inconvenient because they placed people together. They anchored timelines. They stripped away plausible deniability. Once images exist, memory follows. Memory brings witnesses. Witnesses invite questions, and questions fracture silence. Within this narrative, the resurfaced photographs allegedly placed Meghan Markle inside elite social environments later associated with Epstein's broader network. Not one city, not one moment, but repeated proximity across locations and years. New York, the Mediterranean. Private gatherings where phones were discouraged and the press didn't exist.
Focused on her and the sexual crimes. It was deeply frustrating to sit there and sort of see names of famous wealthy people. Yes, they were on planes, they knew Jeffrey Epstein, but you kept wondering, well...
What unsettles isn't what the images show, it's what they confirm. Presence. Presence does not equal guilt, but it does equal opportunity. And opportunity is where every serious inquiry begins. Before global fame, before royal titles, Meghan Markle was something uniquely valuable in elite circles. Unremarkable, unknown. According to the narrative, she moved through high-level social spaces precisely because no one was paying attention. She wasn't famous enough to chase, not powerful enough to question, not important enough to track. In rooms like those, anonymity is camouflage. Invitations arrived without scrutiny. Attendance required no explanation. Travel didn't raise eyebrows. Unknown faces filled seats, added atmosphere, then disappeared again without consequence. According to this account, her presence blended seamlessly into a world built on discretion. Only later did those years become dangerous, because once status arrives, obscurity turns into liability. Every Every undocumented trip becomes suspicious. Every erased photograph becomes a question mark. Every unexplained connection becomes something someone eventually wants to trace. According to source claims, one of the most consistent corridors into these elite spaces was Soho House, a private members club designed to look artistic, casual, harmless, while quietly connecting powerful individuals behind closed doors. In 2015, Meghan Markle was allegedly flown to Istanbul for a Soho House opening. At the time, she wasn't a star. She was described as atmosphere, someone to populate rooms, attend dinners, maintain social energy. But these weren't casual gatherings. They attracted financiers, royalty-adjacent figures, media power brokers, and people who valued discretion above publicity. Invitations functioned as currency. Presence implied access. What later raised questions was the scale. International flights, premium accommodations, repeated appearances, levels of mobility that seemed inconsistent with her professional earnings at the time. According to the narrative, even peers quietly wondered how it was funded. No one asked. In that corridor, you don't ask how someone arrived, only whether they belong. To understand why the resurfaced images matter, sources say you have to understand the Epstein environment. This wasn't a single island or one mansion. It was a network, a social ecosystem. Introductions were informal. Accountability was absent. Silence was expected. According to the narrative, Meghan Markle was allegedly present in New York during periods when Prince Andrew was also there, times when Epstein's social calendar was active. The significance isn't one overlap, it's repetition. One coincidence fades. Patterns don't. These spaces weren't governed by guest lists or sign-in sheets. They ran on trust, discretion, and omission. Phones discouraged. Records minimal. What happened inside stayed inside. That's why proximity matters here. Not to accuse, but to establish who could see, hear, and understand what others later described under oath. As the narrative widens, analysts point to familiar trajectories. Young women moving through elite party circuits, early modeling or social roles, proximity to power. Then, elevation through marriage or institutional attachment. Once elevated, the earlier years fade quietly, not erased, absorbed. In this framework, Epstein isn't portrayed as chaotic, he's portrayed as strategic, placing people in environments where upward mobility existed and where institutions later had reason to protect what they absorbed. Once status is achieved, silence becomes policy. By 2016, the timeline tightens. According to claims, February appears in two stories that were never meant to overlap. One public, meeting Prince Harry. One private, alleged yacht weeks. Invitation-only excursions designed for privacy. Floating social spaces with no press, no phones, no records. The significance isn't accusation, it's overlap. When origin stories share the same window, questions arise naturally, not because anyone demands answers, but because timelines don't bend easily. And in stories involving power, timing speaks louder than words. According to source claims, Meghan Markle's name didn't surface dramatically. It entered quietly, in legal back channels, in discussions about witnesses, not defendants, about who might have seen or known things others later described. Virginia Giuffre was said to have considered calling her as a potential witness, not because of royal status, but because of proximity, residency, association, presence within overlapping social ecosystems. She was never called, but once a name enters that context, it cannot be unseen. It shifts gossip into relevance, speculation into record, and records don't disappear easily. Around the same time, image archives changed. Photos once accessible became restricted. Licensing vanished. Search results narrowed. According to claims, major archives quietly limited access to certain pre-royal images. No explanation given. Archives don't do that without cause. Images are assets. Restricting them signals risk. Legal, reputational, institutional, and risk implies awareness. The timing is what unsettled observers. The changes came after renewed interest in Epstein's network, after Maxwell's conviction, after legal discussions reopened. It looked less like coincidence, more like containment, but containment expires. According to source claims, Maxwell's posture shifted once her sentence was secured. With no future to protect, information became currency. Names became leverage, not shouted, cataloged. Sources describe her not as confessing, but remembering who was present, who traveled, who blended in. Memory doesn't accuse, it destabilizes. Analysts began re-examining the resurfaced images, background faces, lighting, yachts, locations. What once looked generic formed a map. Each photo anchored a moment. Each chipped away at deniability. This is where the story stops being about one person. It becomes systemic, about how institutions overwrite inconvenient pasts once status is achieved, not by deleting history, but by simplifying it. Once someone becomes useful, their past becomes protected. Now people are looking again, rebuilding timelines, tracing overlaps, asking why certain years went silent, why entire social circuits vanished from biographies overnight. The question isn't what did she do, it's what did she know? Because knowledge only requires presence, and presence in this narrative has been established. Silence once did the work, but silence has limits. According to source claims, what finally fractured control wasn't Maxwell's speaking. It wasn't the photographs, it was pattern recognition. Once people saw the structure, the corridors, the function of anonymity, the story stopped being about a duchess or a disgraced financier. It became about how power moves people quietly, then pretends it didn't. And when stories reach that point, they don't need proof to feel real. They feel coherent, because placement, once established, cannot be undone. The silence that protected the past is fracturing, and what comes next won't be loud. It will be methodical. And as that fracture spreads, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The story stops living only in whispered corners and starts breathing on its own. Not because someone made an accusation, but because too many pieces now sit next to each other without explanation. Silence can survive questions, but it cannot survive alignment. People begin noticing how often the same names drift through the same spaces, the same cities, the same years, the same social corridors. They notice how certain friendships were once visible, then quietly erased. How entire chapters of life are summarized in vague phrases, smoothed over until they barely resemble lived experience. Not denied, just softened, sanitized, made safe. And that's where discomfort settles in. Because when narratives are carefully curated, the rough edges matter most. The unphotographed trips, the gatherings without press, the introductions that never made it into memoirs or interviews. Those are the places where truth tends to hide, not because it's explosive, but because it's inconvenient. According to the narrative, this is why the resurfaced images carry weight far beyond their content. They don't accuse. They situate. They remind people that history doesn't begin when a title is granted or a ring is placed on a finger. History begins long before that, in rooms where nobody thought the future would ever come looking. The more analysts revisit these timelines, the harder it becomes to separate coincidence from choreography. That not because someone planned a single outcome, but because systems reward silence and punish disruption. Once someone ascends, institutions instinctively protect the ascent. They don't need to erase the past, they only need to make it boring enough that no one asks questions. But boredom breaks when patterns emerge. Online researchers keep circling back to the same point. Why do certain years feel hollow? Why do biographies leap from audition to advocacy with so little texture in between? Why do social connections that once appeared casually in photographs now seem to have never existed at all? The answer within this story isn't scandal, it's structure. Elite spaces function on plausible deniability. Everyone sees just enough to claim ignorance later. Everyone hears just enough to stay quiet, and everyone benefits from not remembering too clearly, until someone no longer benefits. That's what makes Maxwell's alleged recollections so destabilizing. Not because they introduced something new, but because they refuse to forget what everyone else agreed to blur. Memory, when detailed, becomes a form of rebellion, and once memory is spoken, even quietly, it spreads. At this stage, the question hovering over everything isn't whether consequences will follow. It's whether the narrative can continue holding its shape. Because once people stop asking what happened and start asking who was there, the ground shifts. Presence doesn't shout, it lingers. And in this story, presence has a way of refusing to disappear, no matter how carefully the silence was constructed. The silence was constructed. The silence was constructed. The silence was...